Hi, I'm Lynn Donaldson from Connect Strategic Solutions Group. We focus on helping mid-sized pharma and medical device companies to launch their valuable products so that patients' treatment choices and needs can be met. Over the next couple of months, we will be interviewing experts from various functions who are integral to the launch of these valuable products. The goal is benchmarking and how do we define and achieve success. So we're going to gather the bigger picture of what our experts consider will drive a successful product launch. We're providing the podcast participants with ideas that will trigger thoughts that they could employ. We also want to identify potential innovations that can move the industry forward as a whole. We will not share any proprietary information because we want our experts to speak in generalities based on their experience. Today we're kicking off our podcast with someone who is not only a dear friend, but also someone who I collaborate with often and who brings a different perspective to product launch. Nancy Barlow has worked in the life science industry for 30 years and has a wealth of experience in supporting companies throughout the launch process. Hi Nancy, it's lovely to talk to you today and thank you so much for joining me. Do you mind if we get into the questions? Sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you, Lynn. I'm very happy to be here.
So, are you in the pharmaceutical or medical devices industry?
I'm actually a consultant focused on integrated marketing strategy, and I serve both pharma and device companies and have deep experience in both.
Perfect. And exactly how long have you been in the industry? I mentioned 30 years. Is that correct?
Yes, you got that right. It's nearly 30 years, even though that's hard to admit.
We all have that problem, admitting that. So what function, department or role do you serve?
I've done a lot of work across the board. I actually have quite a broad background, having worked with commercial, medical affairs, clinical, and R&D in bringing products to market. For both U.S. and global clients. And I've also done a lot of strategic planning work at all levels. And so sometimes that's at the asset level, sometimes a portfolio, and in smaller and mid-sized companies at the corporate level.
That's an amazing amount of experience. And what are the challenges to a successful product launch from your perspective?
That's really a great question, Lynn, because launches have become so much more difficult over time. Starting with the fact that we have smaller launch windows. Companies are bringing products to market in a very rapid window of time, and there are also rapid expectations for success. There was some interesting work done by IQVIA many years ago that indicated that the trajectory you have in the first 6 months of launch defines your trajectory for the product's lifetime. And so understanding those smaller launch windows becomes really important. There's also, in pharma, there's a dynamic of fewer NMEs. So it's really hard to find that distinction. It has to either be created or built, particularly if you are the fourth or fifth or sixth entry in a given therapeutic space. We've seen an evolution of payers that have effectively begun to make treatment decisions by virtue of their formulary sequencing requirements, which has been challenging across the board. We've seen scenarios where other dynamics have changed, like HCPs being really challenged to navigate a complex system. And if they don't do it right, they lose precious reimbursement dollars if they make the wrong decisions. And as an industry, we can really help them navigate that system. We've also seen KOLs getting tired of being spokespeople for canned content. The traditional speaker circuit is really changing. That dynamic is challenging for KOLs because they want to be more involved in the decision making. And so those are just a few of some of the challenges. And there's obviously others that I'm sure people face every day.
I know what you mean. I've been in the industry about the same length of time as you, and there have been so many changes that we've seen across the board. But how do you define successful product launch?
So that actually would depend on your point of view, I suppose. If you think about the different areas and functions within a pharmaceutical and device company, launch success is going to be defined differently by those different functions. So, for example, if you're commercial, you're looking for the sales curve, NRXs and TRXs. If you're medical affairs, you're focused on ensuring that KOLs and HCPs have an understanding of the clinical value of your asset and over time become advocates for it. And if you're in the payer space, or frankly, anywhere in the commercial side of things, you're looking for a favorable formulary status and contracting. So all of these things are actually important to come together for true success.
Yes, and both you and I have seen over the years how this has changed within each department or function even as to what they're looking for. What would you say are the examples of successful product launches? Can you give me some examples, or have you observed some of the characteristics that make a successful product launch?
Wow, we could probably spend the balance of our podcast talking about this question. There's a lot in here. So let me see if I can break down some of the thoughts. So I would say, thinking about the characteristics, as you say, that make a successful product launch, first and foremost is assembling a diverse and coordinated cross-functional team. So often the team members are limited to a select few, largely driven by the commercial team. And there really needs to be a much broader perspective, all of whom need to be aligned on the strategic path forward, and importantly, the interdependencies for each of them being able to do their end of the job well. A second one might be to start early. So often when I talk to clients, they are anywhere from 6 months to 2 years out from launch and really need to be thinking about things 3 to 4 years prior to launch. It takes time to shift attitudes, to figure out what the unmet need is, to build credibility, to establish advocacy, and there's a lot that goes into it. So maybe I can talk about those a little bit more deeply. So
Sure.
Thinking about developing the market, right? There's a lot that goes into developing the therapeutic space, starting with collecting insights and finding that unmet need. So you're going to be looking at therapeutic area trends that might impact or signal the need, the unmet need. You'd be looking at competitive frameworks and what's happening, and also overall what stakeholder perceptions are. And it's important that when you're thinking about an unmet need, you identify one, because there could be several, but identify one that could be uniquely addressed by your asset. If you can't find an unmet need, sometimes you can find a gap that allows you to create an unmet need. So if you think back to social anxiety and restless leg syndrome, those were really first of their kind categories. Not to say that the symptoms didn't exist, but they became mainstream and made acceptable by drug makers who were able to allow patients to come out and deal with these problems and get treatment for it. Another example of a gap where it wasn't new was the concept of erectile dysfunction. Mm-hmm. So, it was just a recategorization of impotence, which had somehow, and quite unfortunately, become a label for your character and not just your physical condition. So the rebranding of the disease with erectile dysfunction allowed patients to come and feel comfortable addressing this particular condition. So collecting insights for an unmet need becomes really important part of developing the market, as does building relationships, both with KOLs and with payers. Mm-hmm. So from the KOL perspective, you want to be looking at identifying who they are, segmenting them into ways that make sense, whether it's by their belief system or their specialty or even some of their skills, building consistent and coordinated engagement plans to build those relationships, generate advice and insight, and provide some reactive education for them, or even proactive in the case of publications. And on the payer side, really looking to uncover what their coverage policies are and their thresholds for wanting to have a favorable contracting with a new product based on their advantages over standard of care. So a lot goes into developing the market, but that's not where a successful product launch would stop. We have to keep, I know I'm getting into a lot of detail here.
That's fine.
But really, there's a lot of things to consider. So, another thing to consider would be to identify and communicate your unique value proposition. So we just established what the clinical unmet need was. Now we need to position your product, whether it's a device or a pharmaceutical agent, and how it meets that clinical need. What value does it confer to all stakeholders? And how would that then drive the value dossier for the payer audience? So we've developed the market, we've communicated our value proposition, then we need to build a clear and focused evidence generation plan. And this should be multi-year. And, whether this is for an originator product or biosimilar, there is undoubtedly the need for evidence generation, and looking to tie it into key areas of how your product is different. But very importantly, and I don't see this a lot, is aligning it with the scientific narrative, where each feeds the other. So most companies do an excellent job of figuring out how to translate their data into their scientific messaging that ultimately will become promotional messaging. But I don't see as often putting together an ideal narrative that would indicate what kind of evidence generation would be needed to fill those gaps. So really looking at it both ways. And then educating the therapeutic area as necessary. If you're the fourth one to market, you probably don't have to spend as much time on disease education and can focus on your MOA. And, this would be a little bit different if you're a biosimilar product. So if you're the first biosimilar, you're going to be spending a lot more time educating on the value of biosimilars. But if you are the nth biosimilar into the market, then you're in this odd position of having a product predicated on sameness, where you now have to also distinguish from other biosimilars. So it can be very, very challenging. Another area for successful launches is regulatory coordination, making sure there are real early discussions with FDA from the start of the studies that you want to conduct and the protocols and what their expectations were. I have seen instances in the last few years where those lines of communication were not as open as they could have been, and there were some unpleasant surprises when there was an expected launch approval that didn't come.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that's an awful place to be. And then making sure that the label language that's being proposed is aligned with the value concept that you're defining in the narrative, and recognizing that there are some key differences here between the scientific and the commercial side of things, and that can be a challenge, but you always want to make it a goal. Let's see, what else? Clearly operational excellence and getting it right the first time. The cross-functional teams I talked about, understanding what those interdependencies are, like I can't get this done until you provide that. medical training of the cross-functional team becomes really important so that they are as prepared as possible. And, I haven't talked much about the scenario of a global launch, but it's really important to make sure that there is alignment on a centralized strategy, but there's enough flexibility with regions to be able to tweak things as they need based on their own specific dynamics. Maybe there's a different competitive framework, regulatory scenario, compliance, payer structure, that they need that flexibility. So I'm going to just take a breath here. I know I just said an awful lot to see if you had questions on what I talked about.
Well, there certainly seems a lot to do, and as you say, the team are so important, and then getting the right strategy. As you mentioned, the regulatory coordination, amongst the many things that you've mentioned, but there's an awful lot to do, and that's why companies usually start 3 to 4 years before launch, because there is so much to do. So,
exactly.
So thank you for being so comprehensive. That has given us a lot of food for thought. Now, we've talked about a successful launch, but how would you define maybe a suboptimal launch?
Oh, goodness. That probably happens more often than the successful launches, right? Because of just, Murphy's Law. And, I think the easiest way to express it is sort of the reverse of everything that I just talked about. The absence of anything that we just discussed really can create shortcomings in having advocacy for your agent. You want that momentum at the point of launch of having all that advocacy so that from a commercial perspective, they're ready to take it up right away. So if you're lacking that advocacy, if they don't understand your clinical value, particularly over standard of care, that's a challenge. And if you don't have reasonable market access. So it's hard to say, other than that, how to avoid it. And so what I typically will recommend to my clients is to anticipate the unanticipated. And what I mean by that is have some backup plans, do some scenario planning. And there's a lot of scenario planning that can save you some grief in the short term, where you can look at, what are your competitive advances likely to be? What could their data swings look like? What key initiatives might they have? How are the things that happen with competitors likely to affect your asset? And there's different ways of looking at that. There's sort of the direct impact of a class effect, as happened with the COX-2s many years ago, or indirectly, where there's just eroded trust from HCPs who have seen so many new agents in general that just don't perform as intended. So figuring out what the competitive framework could do to the acceptance or potential acceptance of your product could be important. Looking at potential regulatory delays and how would that impact the change in your launch plans. What about regulatory restrictions if you don't get the label language or claims that you want? If you think about how TPPs, target product profiles, are done, they're done in ranges. The same concept could be true from a scientific and commercial standpoint to look at, what would happen if we could or couldn't say certain things. And of course, there's the ever unpleasant manufacturing delays, whether it's from plant inspections or the supply chain challenges that are so rampant right now, or even human challenges and human resource problems. So a lot of different ways you can look at scenario plans. And I think the other thing I would say could be a good thing to do would be wargaming. I think most of the pharmaceutical and device companies that I've seen have done wargaming, certainly internally, where you put on your competitor's hat and you figure out how to kill your own product. Because when you're doing a general situation analysis, we tend to still be thinking from our perspective and can often sometimes without realizing it, sugarcoat the scenario. But when you do wargaming, you say, okay, now I'm putting on my competitor's hat and I'm going to figure out how to kill my product. You come out much more aggressively, which is a more realistic expectation of what your competitors are going to do. I think the difference I would add here is that I've done it successfully with KOLs as well as from an internal perspective, and they bring a lot more to the party than you might just do internally. So that could be another thing to consider in how to avoid a suboptimal launch.
You mentioned the Vioxx story. Our company were working with one of the COX-2 inhibitors, and nobody saw that coming. So I get your point about scenario planning and really thinking about the war gaming. We did multiple war games with the company we were working with, but we never saw that one coming. So it's something that you really need to delve into a little bit deeper, I think. But it's so important to have your contingency plans, because things go wrong with product launches, as you've said, and they happen and they come out of left field and you just don't know where it came from. But it's important to have that contingency planning ready. So thank you for that. I mean, it's given us a good idea of what a suboptimal launch might look like. Do you have any examples of products that were not as successful as perhaps they could have been? I know you mentioned the Vioxx story, but have you got any other examples?
Let me think about that. I'd love to say that every product launch I worked on was a fabulous success, but the law of averages says that that's not always going to be the case. There was one product I worked on that was an in-body device with a 510K clearance. And for those who may not be familiar, a 510K clearance is given out by the FDA. It's different than an approval. And whereas an approval is a highly rigorous path with clinical studies and significant endpoints to hit, a 510K clearance is based on a predicate device where your device has some similarities to a product that has already been cleared, and it requires no clinicals and very little oversight. And so when this happens, and it's my understanding that most of the medical devices on the U.S. market today are 510K cleared. When this happens, it can trick one into rushing into a path to launch, particularly when there is, revenue generation model to hit. And so in this situation, the product that I worked on, the company had planned to launch without clinicals, which turned out to be a mistake for an in-body device.
Yeah.
So, what happened was it started with the fact that there was a poorly defined unmet need. There was a resistance to the way the product benefits were defined versus the standard of care. So I'll give you an example. If you think about Coumadin or warfarin, HCPs hated the fact that they had to constantly monitor and titrate patients who were on warfarin, but it became so standardized that when other drugs came to market that didn't require monitoring, it left HCPs feeling like, well, that's how I manage patients, and so now what I'm supposed to do. There was a similar scenario in the product I worked on where the standard of care was, had a lot of disadvantage to it, but it had become the standard. It was the only thing out there. It became the norm. So the company was left with no defined unmet need and trying to sell a product without a perceived benefit. So that was problem number one. Problem number two was the label that they were going to end up with, which is based on your predicate device, remember, was counter to their desired clinical story. So, what goes into the selection of which predicate to go on, I don't have that level of regulatory background, but it makes a big difference which you pick. So there were a couple of instances where the predicate device label language was going to really hurt us, starting with how the device was classified. It was using terminology that was associated with similar devices that had a high rate of product failures and a high rate of side effects. So immediately you start with that negative halo that may have nothing to do with your product. The second element was the speed of degradation. So the standard of care actually did not degrade in the body. It was a permanent structure in the body. And that is typically not good. You don't want a foreign device or foreign body in your you don't want a foreign body inside your own body.
No.
It's not considered positive. And this device, the standard of care, didn't degrade at all. And we were designed to degrade over time as the burden was taken over by your own body tissue. That should have been perceived as a real benefit, but it was so anathema to the standard of care that the doctors didn't know what to do with it. And then, on top of that, the feedback was that they wouldn't use the device without clinical proof of safety. They were less concerned about the efficacy, which could be proven through these, degradation and tensile strength and some of the R&D elements, but they needed clinical proof of safety. So the product was headed into a world of hurt. However, to the company's credit, they really stepped back and reevaluated and took a completely different approach to launch. So they postponed the launch. They built out an evidence generation plan. I won't say it was robust, but they worked with the KOLs to figure out what would be the sufficient level of evidence for adoption of the product. They created a KOL steering committee, which was the same group of KOLs that progressed with the commercialization of the product over time, who were able to provide feedback on the prototype and the ability to change the characteristics of the prototype of the device itself, who helped them design the protocol and the elements of the study that would be important to define the messaging and the scientific narrative that was going to position this product well and to generate insights. So, through these guys, there was also the development of a Center of Excellence program in order to build surgical skill and over time advocacy. So they really did a nice job of stepping back and starting again and had a much more successful path forward.
And that just proves that if you do step back, if you have a hiccup, just step back, look at it again, and you can still have a successful launch. That's an amazing story, where they've recovered and what they've done well. So thank you for that. Thank you for the story. When you look at success, what metrics do you think are good to use to measure success? What metrics have you used?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of variability in what would make for successful measures, but I think what they have in common is a couple of things. And I always like to say, begin with the end in mind. Like, what are your goals? What do you hope is going to happen? And build your success factors or your key performance indicators, your KPIs, based on that. So often when I talk to clients and I see if they have KPIs at all, and not all do, that most companies use metrics that reflect the delivery of their function, like, the number of interactions that they're going to have with KOLs or how much they're going to publish, things that they are expected to do as part of launch excellence. And so it's really important that companies and products quantify the impact, not the execution. So if you look at the word key performance indicators, performance as a concept is how the impact that you're going to have, not whether or not you did what you were supposed to do. So I will tend to, suggest, think about what must you achieve. So some examples of that, and it's going to be very different depending on your own therapeutic space, but you could start with things like X% of KOLs become an advocate for your asset prior to launch, or the majority of KOLs understand your mechanism of action, or X% of plans have your asset on formulary. The things that become the bar that you set to know that you've been successful, and the things that make a successful launch. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. Thank you. And just a quick sort of clarifying question. Why do you use these metrics over others? I mean, you've kind of sort of talked about it a little bit on the way, but can you give us a little bit more why you use these specific metrics?
Sure. When you're thinking about your delivery of functional efforts, I think I might have said this just a moment ago, but it's more of a job description, right? It's not about the impact you have. And if you think about the performance is an indicator of success. So it's not an indicator of success that you've talked to 100 people. It's an indicator of success, what happened. So, they have an understanding or they feel a certain way is an indicator of success. The hurdles, basically, that you have to go through. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example. If you say that you want to touch 500 KOLs, have 500 interactions, supposing you achieved your goal of advocacy at 300 interactions, wouldn't you want to retool your plan for the next 200? Maybe you want to advance their thinking in a certain way or go to a broader number of KOLs. And the converse is also true. If you hit your 500 interactions and they're still not an advocate for your plan, then what impact did those 500 interactions actually have? And so I don't mean it to sound quite as black and white as it's coming out, but I think the point is to identify the result that you would like to see and use that as an indicator of success, right? Because you're measuring it against a favorable launch scenario, which is not about the number of touches and the number of publications. It's about how they think and feel and what they're going to do as a result.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did that clarify?
Yes, thank you. I mean, because it is all about, if you can get clarification, your interactions and the KOLs know the product, like the product, then you're much more likely to have adoption at launch. Okay, tricky question here, because many people have different views on this, and this is one of the things we want to gather. What functions do you see are a priority for a successful launch, and why?
That is a tricky or cheeky. I don't know if you said tricky or cheeky. It's both. And I work with multiple functions, and of course, every one of them contributes importantly. And if you think about a cross-functional team in general, you're going to have commercial and regulatory and medical and clinical and a patient marketing or advocacy function. You'll have market access or HEOR. You'll have manufacturing. You might even have corporate communications and probably others I'm not even thinking about off the top of my head. All of them are going to play a really important role in the launch. But I would tend to say, if I had to pick one, I would probably say that medical affairs has in recent years become of much greater importance than they historically had been as the hub of the wheel. Because if you think about everything we've been talking about for the last, half hour or so, a lot of that has to happen in a pre-launch environment to develop the market and build advocacy early. And so medical affairs becomes the vehicle to compliantly do that. So if you think about everything they'd be responsible for, from generating KOL relationships and advocacy to working with clinical to develop a meaningful evidence generation plan, to defining the scientific value and building a narrative to communicate that value against the unmet need that's been defined, to develop publications and, an educational dissemination plan for scientific credibility. Not a whole lot you could do proactively outside of publications in a pre-launch environment, but building those relationships becomes important. They are contextualizing what's happening in the therapeutic space and very actively monitoring competitive, not to say that others are not as well, but if you think about all of this, including the training that they do for the internal team, I would say because of their ability to get into the market and the therapeutic space prior to commercial makes them very critical. And of course, this is all happening in concert with the folks who are driving market access, because you can have all the advocacy you want. If you're not on formulary or you don't have a favorable contracting scenario, you're going to hit a dead end there too. So I would say all of the functions are critically important, but medical and market access, I think, are the ones that become the springboard for that success and trajectory post-launch.
I would agree with you there. I mean, after phase 2, your medical affairs team usually pick the product up, and it's not till later that the marketing team picked up. But also medical affairs are the experts in this particular therapy area. They are talking peer-to-peer, and they are also, like you say, they understand the data so in depth, and they breathe this data. So they're probably the most important early on, as well as, like you say, the market access, because, as you say, if you can't get on a formulary, and that's where the medical affairs team come in. But I agree with you. Overall, the whole cross-functional team make the product a success. It's just medical affairs get the product earlier to start working on all of this. So,
yeah, great points, Lynn.
Let's think about the last 18 months or 2 years. We've seen a lot of changes in the environment, shall we say, and therefore a lot of changes in the industry. I mean, you and I have both know that there's been a lot of changes over the last 30 years. And every time something happens, the industry changes, we adapt, we move, and we focus on different things. But in your expertise and experience, what trends have you seen in the industry over the last 18 months to 2 years?
Wow, we could do a whole separate podcast just on that, I think.
Yeah.
I think there's been quite a lot, but I'll just name a few. And, not surprisingly, the first one everyone thinks about is the significant shift to virtual activity. Mm-hmm. No surprise there. Excuse me. So, the challenge of seeing KOLs, which was getting harder and harder even before everything went virtual, is now becoming even harder because everybody's got Zoom fatigue. And it means that the reasons for your call need to be significantly amped up. And we hear frustration from MSLs that it's really getting harder and harder to do that. And the other, more favorable aspect of shifting to virtual is the greater use of telemedicine and the ability to get more patients more attention during these difficult times. So, that's one. I think another one is, and probably partly a result of this, is a move to more visualization and simplification. I think about the posters that have been developed while things went virtual. They got simpler, no more 8-point type, a lot more visualization, the use of infographics, more visual abstracts, things like that. We've talked about the growing importance of medical affairs as a strategic driver. And, I haven't spent a lot of time talking about hospitals, but even with hospitals, we've seen trends that there are changes in revenue models in hospitals. So it used to be all about filling beds, And now the transition is moving to more ambulatory services and walk-in clinics, or within the network, the creation of more centers of excellence or destination centers or medical home, even where your care is more coordinated. So, I mean, I could go on for a long time, but those are just a few that I've known.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, like you say, there have been a number of changes, and this is just some of them, and we could maybe do a whole podcast on this. But I mean, I had a telemedicine appointment this morning with my own PCP, so I get that. I think we've all suffered Zoom fatigue, and the challenge of seeing people, some of the teams that we've worked with or work with, they've had the challenge of seeing the key opinion leaders, and it's been really hard for them because, like you say, you need a reason, because everybody's constantly on the phone or on a Zoom meeting, and so you really need the idea to talk, why you want to talk to somebody, to get them on that Zoom meeting. But I know a number of people have managed it, so I think people are just getting used to it now. Teams are getting used to this new event. Okay, so thank you for covering that. So last question, I think, just about last question. What do you think needs to be done to increase launch success going forward, given what we've just talked about?
Well, if I tried to summarize everything that we just said, I would say we have to have a clear identification of an unmet need and not just be the fifth one of the same thing. Mm-hmm. There are realities where you will be the fifth one of the same thing, but you still need to find a different way to talk about the value of that product. defining or building an unmet need, earlier commencement of activities. You know, don't be thinking 6 months to 2 years. Try and think, as you said, around phase 2, 3 to 4 years out. And, you know, that cross-functional alignment and collaboration becomes really important. And thinking about how to coordinate an aligned strategic plan, and that's true, again, globally and regionally, centralized strategy, regional adaptation, and, you know, really working together on those interdependencies. I think those things are probably the key.
Okay, cool.
Excuse me.
No worries. That's given us a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much, Nancy. This has been so awesome, and I've loved hearing your insights. The idea is here, the experience. You've got such a vast experience, and that came through with your insights. So thank you very much.
Well, great. Thanks. I'm glad you found it helpful, and thanks for having me. I've enjoyed being here.
Thank you. So we've gathered the bigger picture of what some of our experts consider to drive a successful launch. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our goal is to provide podcast participants with the ideas to trigger the thoughts that they could maybe employ, or potential innovations that could move the industry forward as a whole. Because there's another goal here is, let's think about the industry and let's think about how we can help it move forward. So we'd really love to have your feedback. So if you have any questions or feedback or comments, please contact me at lynn@connectorstrategy.com, and we really look forward to hearing from you. Again, Nancy, thank you so much for being a guest. We really appreciated you being here and for all your valuable insights. Thank you.
Great, thank you.